Welcome to this edition of Author. I'm Joe Skelly. The statistics on suicide in America are startling. A suicide is committed every 17 minutes, most by people under age 40. And suicide in the young has more than tripled since 1955. Today's guest, Kay Redfield Jamison, writes about the subject from a personal and professional standpoint. Her new book is called Night Falls Fast: Understanding Suicide. Jamison is professor of psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She is the co-author of the standard medical text on manic depressive illness, which was chosen in 1990 as the most outstanding book in biomedical sciences by the American Association of Publishers. She is the author of 4 books and approximately 100 scientific publications about mood disorders, suicide, psychotherapy, and lithium, including the best-selling and award-winning book, An Unquiet Mind, a memoir of moods and madness. An honorary professor of English at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, Jamison is the recipient of numerous national and international scientific awards, including the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Research Award. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, Richard Wyatt, who is a physician and scientist at the National Institutes of Health. Kay Redfield Jamison, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Governor Jesse Ventura recently commented on suicide in his Playboy interview, and I'm going to read you his exact quote. He said, "I have no respect for anyone who would kill himself. If you're to the point of killing yourself and you're that depressed, life can only get better. If you're a feeble, weak-minded person to begin with, I don't have time for you." What was your reaction to these comments?
Well, outrage, basically, and astonishment that in 1999 anyone would be making those statements, much less the governor of a major state. I found his remarks uneducated and irresponsible. I think the governor is at many levels responsible for the public health of his state. And to be so, it's one thing if you just defer to other people and say, look, I really don't know very much about it, but my whomever will take care of it. But he didn't. I mean, he talked as though he knew something about it. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's dangerous.
What would you want to tell him, first off, if you could sit down with him?
Well, I mean, I would say that, there's a lot known about suicide, and life is not so simple, nor so clever, nor so glib, and it may be attractive to some people to just shoot from your hip, but you're shooting bullets when you make remarks like that, because people in fact die by this. This is not a trivial matter. This is a major public health epidemic, and those kind of remarks are just dumb.
In fact, the Surgeon General recently came out with, what was it called, a call to action to prevent suicide?
Right. I think if you wanted to take 2 extremes in temperament, intelligence, thoughtfulness, and effectiveness, ultimately, you would look at David Satcher, Dr. David Satcher, who's Surgeon General of the United States, who has looked at the statistics on suicide, has looked at what we know about the medicine and the science and the psychology of suicide, and said, look, this is an epidemic in this country. It's a big problem, and I think the Surgeon General's office ought to be doing something about it, to raise awareness about it, to raise awareness about mental illness, that these illnesses are treatable and recognizable. And that's just, it's wonderful to have somebody who is as respectful of the science and human nature and compassion. And I have to say, you couldn't have 2 more different people talking about the same subject.
I mentioned some of the statistics in the introduction. Can you give us kind of the broad statistics and what
Yes.
they mean to you?
Well, I mean, suicide across the world accounts for 1 million deaths a year. It accounts for 2% of the deaths, which makes it a common cause of death, actually. In this
2% of deaths.
Right. So that's a lot of deaths. In this country, is 1% of deaths, and it costs 30,000 people their lives a year. But in addition to those 30,000 people and all the people that affects, there are also 500,000, 500,000 suicide attempts that are serious enough to warrant being treated in an emergency room. There's a lot of people with suicidal behavior, and much of it unnecessary, preventable.
What is your main point about suicide then? You're getting at maybe the biggest misconception about suicide.
Well, I mean, I think one misconception about suicide is that it's rare. It's not rare. It's common. And the mental illnesses that are responsible for maybe 90 to 95% of suicides, are very common, and they're common in young people. The average age of onset of one of those illnesses, for example, bipolar illness or manic depression, is 18. The average age of onset of schizophrenia is about 19. The average age of depression is very young, of drug and alcohol abuse, and these are the major illnesses that go into suicide. So you're talking about a population that's very young, that's disproportionately affected by these illnesses, that is uninformed about the signs and symptoms of these illnesses, hasn't a clue what it means to have an illness like depression. I mean, people just get hit by depression. They don't go around thinking, I have depression, I have a treatable illness. That's not how people think about it. They think, I don't have any energy, I want to die, what's the point? Everything's despairing.
Mm-hmm. We certainly have many examples of famous people that have committed suicide. You have quite a story about a young man named Drew Sopirak.
Sopirak, yes.
Sopirak in your book. Tell us about him.
Right. Drew Sopirak was a Air Force cadet at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado. When he was in high school, he was valedictorian of his class. He was captain of his teams. He was hugely popular, homecoming king, good-looking, charming, in the best possible sense, not superficial charming, but genuinely charming. A great friend, you know, somebody who would do anything for anybody. He was deeply loved young man, and went to the Air Force Academy, wanted to be a pilot, wanted to fly. That's what he wanted to do with his life. He was chosen in his senior year at the Academy as the most outstanding cadet, leadership-wise, which, as you can imagine, at the Air Force Academy is a huge distinction.
Right.
And when he was a senior, he went manic. He had manic depression in his family. He became manic, very psychotic. The Air Force gave him very good medical care, very good treatment, and kind treatment, I think, but just did not allow him to be commissioned. And he was asked, you know, to leave for medical reasons from the Air Force. And a year and a half later, his illness, he responded very well to treatment, but he wouldn't stay on medicine, which is another major public health problem. And young men often don't stay on medicine. He didn't stay on his medicine, and he got very sick indeed, very depressed, and shot himself. And I had met his parents. They'd asked me to give a talk. They were doing kind of a memorial series in his honor. And they told me about him, and I was just taken. I mean, I'm from an Air Force family, and I have manic depression myself. And he was such a wonderful kid. He was the sort of kid that everybody says, how could somebody like that do it? And I wove into my book a whole series of personal essays trying to look at different aspects of suicide. And in the case of Drew, I want people to say, A, these illnesses kill people if they're not treated. And B, he was a wonderful kid, and suicide can hit. I mean, it's not something that's just reserved for other people.
When did this topic hit close to home for you? You say you have manic depression.
Right, well, it hit home when I was about 17, a senior in high school. I got severely depressed the first time, and psychotically so, and just completely out of commission. But like many people, I was able to wing it. You know, you can show up and people assume you're normal unless you do something exceedingly deviant. I mean, after all, I've taught in academic psychiatry departments for 20 years, and it wasn't picked up by my colleagues. And if you try and keep things yourself, you can be more effective than you would like to think, really. And so I got very severely depressed, and I had never, ever thought about suicide in my life. It was inconceivable to me. I loved life. I couldn't wake up. I was just bounce out of the bed in the morning like Tigger, you know, just bounding along and full of life and love of life and friends and school. I love school. You know, I was happy as a clam, and it just went away, and I got morbidly depressed. And I had it in my family, but we didn't talk about it. And I started thinking, well, if this is the way I'm going to feel, this isn't me. It's like being inhabited by a stranger. And
I think Drew, the young man you were talking about, was the same thing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You are inhabited by somebody you don't know, and you don't like, and you don't want there. It's not who you were.
And he related to his friends, you know, the crazy thoughts he was having, and they thought, this is not him. Somebody
else
is
is there.
inside of him.
That's
or
right.
some
I mean,
force.
it sounds a little like alien abductions, but there's an element of truth in it, is that you are not who you were. And I think particularly if you have, I think maybe one of the things I related to with Drew was, if you're sort of perfectionist, you have sort of high standards, and you can't imagine just falling so far. It's inconceivable. And of course, when you're depressed, you don't think anything's going to get better. I mean, the nature of the beast is hopelessness and bleakness. So it's not that you're thinking, well, I just have to endure this for a month or so. you think that's who you are. And I started thinking about suicide a lot. And then when I became a faculty member at UCLA, I went ravingly manic, and I got very, very interested in manic depression overnight. I mean, not overnight, but pretty quickly. And suicide along with it, because they are unfortunately closely related.
And with medication, in the years that you've had manic depression, you haven't had any problems?
No, I've done fine. But in my early years, much like Drew and like many people who are on medication, I stopped taking it. And despite the fact that I knew the literature, the scientific literature, and in fact, I've written some of the scientific literature, it didn't impress upon me. I mean, I was a slow learner, and I stopped my lithium one time too many. And as always, I got psychotically manic, and then morbidly suicidally depressed, and in the midst of that, nearly died from a suicide attempt. And after that, I've stayed on my medicine, and I've been okay. But before that, it was very rough.
If you just joined us, you're watching Author. Our guest today is Kay Redfield Jamison. She's an expert on suicide and manic depression, and her new book is called Night Falls Fast, Understanding Suicide. Tell us about the interesting differences, gender differences.
Right, well, in this country, men are far more likely to kill themselves than women, 4 to 5 times as often. In China, there are more women than men committing suicide. And one reason for that is it's particularly awful if you are impulsive and you are very depressed and you have ready access to a very lethal means, like in this country, firearms, of course. In China, pesticides. So a lot of the young women working out in the fields, that in this country would be a suicide attempt because they would take an overdose of medication, but you would at least, thank heavens, have an opportunity, a second chance to be diagnosed and treated. In China, if you take these particular kind of pesticides that are used for agriculture, they're immediately lethal or almost immediately lethal. There aren't emergency rooms nearby. Medical care is not available. So something that is impulsive becomes deadly.
So in China, the cultural oppression
I don't think it's just cultural oppression, because there are a lot of countries where the cultural oppression is as great against women, and they don't have those kinds of suicide rates. It's still, people are still trying to figure it out. Certainly mental illness is deeply involved, as it is everywhere else in the world. I mean, every study that's been done across the world has shown 90 to 95% of suicides are related to a group of mental illnesses.
So the common thinking is to try and find a different reason, cultural oppression, or
right. I mean, I think everyone wants to scout around and say
someone died in the family, or
right.
some other cause.
Right, but you know, other countries have very high rates, and the oppression is not so high. I don't think by and large social reasons. It's not that they are unimportant. It's just that it's sort of like divorce or losing a job or whatever, being poor. These are not reasons for people to commit suicide. People have these situations all the time, and 1,000 people get divorced, and people don't commit suicide. But somebody who is vulnerable, psychiatrically vulnerable, may do it. The combination of the two may be deadly.
So in the U.S., men are 4 to 5 times more likely
to kill themselves. Women are more likely to attempt suicide. Yes. But in both cases, I mean, in 60% of all suicides in this country, it's firearms. And that, of course, varies from culture to culture.
And that's an interesting thing. In terms of firearm use, more firearms are used in suicide than homicide, right?
Yes, that's right. I mean,
what does that mean to you?
It means a lot of things. It means that a society understandably has focused on violent homicides. I mean, all of us are concerned about it, and concerned about it for young people, concerned about it for ourselves and our own safety. That's a natural thing to be concerned about. But what's been lost in all of that is the suicides, and it's only been now that the violent homicide deaths have gone down that people have begun to say, oh yeah, there's this big death rate from suicide. And plus we do have a Surgeon General who does take it very seriously and has called attention to the problem of suicide. So.
Another surprising thing in the book is more suicides are committed in spring than winter.
Very definitely. I mean, actually the real nadir for committing suicide is December, and everybody kind of thinks, well, you know, gray, grizzly, awful weather, Christmas holidays, bleak despair, loneliness. It's just not true. In 100 studies now, the consistent finding, if you're north of the equator or south of the equator, that spring and summer, early summer, are the months for suicide. Winter is consistently the lowest.
What's the reason?
There are a lot of suggestions. Clearly, light has a very profound effect on the biology of moods and energy, on neurotransmitters like serotonin, the production of thyroid, many things. If you look at patterns of hibernation in animals, very clearly a strong seasonal pattern that animals are obviously up and about in the summer months, energetic and so forth. And one of the things that we know about suicide is that people, when they are at one of their highest risk periods, when they're beginning to get well. Because if you're really deeply, profoundly depressed and you don't have any energy and you don't have decisiveness when you're depressed, then you tend not to kill yourself at that point. But when you begin to feel slightly better and you have more energy and more decisiveness.
You talk about a continuum of suicide. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, suicide clearly is, on the one hand, it's very definable. If you have somebody who has a gunshot wound to the head, has written a suicide note, that's pretty easy to understand as suicide. What do you do about people who take enormous risks with their lives, who go into battle? And many people have written later about depression, that they've taken unnecessary risks, the people who win the Victoria Crosses and so forth. What is that? Is that just risk-taking behavior, or is there an element of a desire to die? Now that gets very speculative, and I've tried to avoid that kind of thing because that is far more speculative. We know from the animal literature that the animals that are most impulsive and destructive to other animals, violent to other animals, destructive to themselves in terms of biting themselves and cutting off their tails and biting through their tails and so forth, that those animals have the same kind of neurochemistry, the same kind of brain chemistry that humans do who are more inclined to commit suicide. We know that suicide has a very often impulsive and violent, highly wired, perturbed, and agitated aspect. So that side of things is, perhaps it's not suicide itself, but it's a suicidal complex. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of people who think about suicide, people who attempt suicide.
What percentage of the population do you think thinks about suicide at some point?
Well,
how common is it?
It's not uncommon. Certainly, 10% of the population will think, reasonably seriously about it. But that's like for maybe a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
If you're actually looking at how many people consider suicide as the solution over a period of weeks, it gets much smaller. Maybe 1 to 2% of the population, maybe even slightly higher, will actually attempt suicide. What's frightening and why it's somewhat of an epidemic proportion is that if the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta has asked college students, and done on thousands and thousands of college students, and one college student in 10 says they have thought seriously about suicide. If you ask high school students, a far higher rate, and not only that, a huge percentage of them have actually, the ones who've thought about it, have actually attempted suicide. So this is very, very frightening. And one thing is, I spent a fair amount of time on college campuses lecturing, and the number of kids who have made very serious suicide attempts that no one else has known about is scary, because they're very alone. They feel very isolated with these feelings.
Where do you begin then to recognize suicidal tendencies in young people?
Well, I think you do a lot of things. I think as a society, you have to have, not to get back to Governor Ventura, but you have to have a compassionate and tolerant society that says, look, mental illnesses are like any other illnesses. They're biologically caused. They cause great devastation and death. So you have to have a society that's aware of these things. And you have to have ways of intervening with people. So you have to go to the school systems, you have to go to the churches, you have to go to parents and give them the words for it. It's hard. Nobody knows how to ask about suicide. We aren't taught that, certainly in my schools, you weren't taught,
right.
How do you ask somebody if they're suicidal? You need to listen very carefully if somebody talks about suicide, to take it very seriously, not to just assume that if they're talking about it, they're not going to do it, because it is of concern. Sit down with somebody if you're concerned about it, say you're concerned, ask them if they're feeling suicidal, point them in the right direction, walk them to an emergency room, call 911. whatever it is you have to do. But as a parent, I think parents need to know that depression is a very common disorder. 1 woman in 5 is going to have a major depression, and 1 man in 10. So it's very common. You're much more likely to get hit by this than kind of these mondo bizarro illnesses that people know all sorts of signs and symptoms about. And we just don't talk about it enough. If you've got depression in your family, if you've got a history of suicide or suicide attempts in your family, if you've got schizophrenia in your family, drug and alcohol abuse, severe anxiety disorders, personality disorders, talk about it with your kids. It doesn't mean that you're ambulance chasing or trying to put the fear of the Lord in them. Just say, these are illnesses that run in our family. I want you to know what the symptoms of depression are, and be careful about drinking if you get depressed. Call me, and if you go up to college, here are the names of some people in the area. I mean, be proactive. We've got to learn to be more proactive. And universities really need to be more proactive. I mean, it's appalling how many universities do not reach out to their students on this.
What have they done in England? Haven't they gone on a set a big goal?
Yeah, they have. England and several of the Scandinavian countries. Australia's had a huge campaign for a suicide prevention campaign, depression awareness campaign, because the best way to probably prevent suicide is not to go on talking about suicide so much as to learn about the illnesses involved. So getting people to be aware of the symptoms of depression. If people are sleeping way too much, if they're tired, if they're feeling hopeless, if they're feeling very pessimistic, if their sleep patterns are changed, if their eating patterns are changed. There are a whole series of signs and symptoms of depression to be concerned about, because it's very treatable. It sometimes takes some time.
Just a few minutes left. I want to talk about a chapter called What Matters It If Rope or Garter? Publishers Weekly called it the book's most devastating chapter.
Yes, it's a chapter about methods of suicide and methods that people have used over the centuries.
There's some history in your book.
There's quite a bit of history.
Right. It's not just a dry textbook.
No, I
or,
hope
right.
not. I hope not. No, because suicide, independent of the devastation it causes, is an intrinsically interesting subject, actually, and the history of people's attitudes about it and so forth, and methods. And there are a lot of very ghoulish methods that have been used, and that I think reflect the desperation that people have had, and the pain and agony and the inventiveness of people who are absolutely determined to die, and that men use different methods than women, that different societies have used different methods, that what went on in ancient Roman cultures and so forth in terms of suicide.
2 of the famous suicide places that you list in the book in Japan and in San Francisco.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is that you will get a particular place that becomes a suicide hot point. And there was a volcano in Japan, and within a couple of years' time, there were thousands of people who had thrown themselves into this volcano. The press gave it huge coverage. I mean, everything, the radio, all the newspapers, all the glossy magazines gave huge attention, and people were literally lining up to throw themselves in. And then they finally closed that, as public health policy would sort of dictate. You shut off these areas because they do have a contagious appeal to people who are very vulnerable. And then a year later, on the other side of the ocean, the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge was inaugurated. And of course, a couple thousand people have gone to their deaths that way. And so I wrote about what is the appeal of certain places, all sorts of different kinds of places that have held appeals and methods, and what does that tell us about the psychology of why people commit suicide.
What, I mean, you've met many people that have committed have gone on to commit suicide, the surviving families, you've had friends, people in your own family. What do you say personally to someone that tells you they're depressed and are thinking about suicide?
I'm very proactive about it. I mean, I think that, whether it's a patient or a family member or a friend or a colleague, I tend to say, what is it I can do? What are you feeling? How serious are you about it? Have you thought of specific things? Make sure that they don't have a gun in the house. In the same way that you would if you were a clinician in your office or working in an emergency room, you would always say, do you have any pills in your house? Do you have guns? Do you have knives? Get rid of anything that somebody could use impulsively. Point them in the direction of help, because there is help. It's not like, the thing that's so tragic about suicide is that there are things that can be done, and we just need all of us to be more aware of them and to reach out more to people.
We want to thank Kay Redfield Jamison for being here. The new book is called Night Falls Fast, Understanding Suicide. What do you think it's going to take in this country in the next, say, 5 years to really bring the resources and knowledge to this?
I think it's going to take, I mean, I think we are lucky that our primary public health person has taken this seriously. As I say, I can't emphasize that strongly enough. It's the first time the Surgeon General's office has even addressed suicide, much less as emphatically. I think it takes the President of the United States saying, this is an issue. Our young people are dying, our older people are dying as well, unnecessarily. We're going to do something about it. It takes the churches taking it seriously. It takes the school systems putting out depression awareness programs and recognition programs. It takes a lot of people working together, and it's not going to be, you know, a quick thing, obviously. But I think people are much more aware now that depression exists and that it can be treated. I think people are not aware how lethal it can be, and they need to be made aware of that, particularly with their kids.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks very much.